and then figuring if they're running and fixing all the tests. And
I just took this live.
There's multiple bugs out there that I'm trying to fix tests. It's loads of fun after 6 months of tests not running at all. So
we had a similar problem with database backups that we found out about when I deleted the dev database that was the shared dev database, because I was just going to restore it from the backup after making some changes. Backups reported every day that they were running. Turns out they weren't.
Yeah. Same type of thing. Hey, all our tests are passing. Oh, well, half of them aren't even running, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Thankfully, I think somebody had a local copy of it in my case.
You ever hear the story about Toy Story 2 and how they got saved by somebody's local backup?
I did not, but I want to hear it.
It's on, I'd say in a Hacker News. I think it was Toy Story 2, somebody at Pixar. And some command got run that deleted an entire code base or database or something huge. And somebody had been working from home and happened to have everything on their local. And so they were able to restore from there. But it deleted the entire movie. And so they were able to restore it. Now, in the end, the entire movie got rewritten and redone anyway. But for a while there, it was pretty scary.
Interesting. Cool. I will check that out. Thanks. I think I found a link to it.
All right. I'm going to push us toward getting started. We're talking about Passport.js. Is that?
That's right.
Am I remembering that right?
Let's do it.
What is JS? What is Passport? I'm kidding. Okay.
It gets stamped periodically.
Right.
All right. To just kind of set a little bit of the outline and pacing and things like that. So I don't know that I want to assume that everybody knows what it is. I know a lot of people use it.
Never assume that.
So we'll probably start there with just what it is and what it does, and then what I found over the years podcasting is people really like the stories, right? So if there's a story behind Passport.js, you may have told it a bunch of times. I don't know that I assume anybody's heard it either. But then also getting into, okay, so how did it get from there to where it is now, and any interesting stories or tidbits or experiences or anything else. And we'll ask questions along the way and try and, see where we take things where we're interested. But I think that's kind of the direction we're going to go after. And then from there, if people want to contribute or you have different authentication strategies. So if I wanted to write my own, what would that involve? So some of those things we'll get into as well.
Perfect.
All right, good deal. I'm going to get us rolling since we're already 15 minutes past start time, and we'll see where we end up. All right, here goes. Hey, welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Steve Edwards.
Hello from a very cold and windy Portland.
AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you live from the year without Santa Claus.
Uh-oh. I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. Go check out javascriptgeniuses.com. That's where I've got my latest stuff going on. We have a special guest this week, and that is Jared Hanson. Now, Jared, I kind of got you down as the person behind or who created Passport.js, but what else do you want people to know about you?
Yeah, so I'm an engineer by background, been doing professional product development for about 20 years now. Most of your listeners would know me from Passport.js, which is a very popular authentication framework in the Node.js ecosystem. I currently work at Okta by way of Auth0. And have been, in addition to being part of the Node.js ecosystem, and really involved in the identity industry and identity world. So things like OpenID Connect, OAuth, etc. And has spent the past 15 or so years kind of focused in that area, which I really enjoy. We can get into.
Yeah, very cool. And as we kind of get rolling, I don't know if I want to assume that people know what Passport.js is. I've talked to quite a number of people who use it. But you want to kind of give us the background as far as like what it is and what it does, what problems it solves, and who may want to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Passport.js is an authentication framework for Node.js. So what that means is it basically handles all areas of logging into your application, be it a web application with a typical HTML user interface, or if you're building API applications and need to do token-based authentication. So it's primarily focused on Express, although it does get used with some of the other frameworks out there, Next.js occasionally, which is very popular these days, and a few other frameworks. It's been around the ecosystem for a long time now. I think my first commits on it were back in 2011, just to give some context for people. I think Node was on like 0.2 at the time, and now it's what 20 something, kind of forget. So, coming on with maybe not the most, most recent topic, but still always very relevant to security. And yeah, like I said, primarily it's a middleware for Express.js. So people familiar, some of this stuff kind of like maybe gets forgotten to history a little bit, but anyone who's writing Express.js apps is very familiar with the middleware pattern. So authentication is just middleware that you stick in your application in order to authenticate a user. If they aren't authenticated, then the middleware stops and the request is denied. Otherwise, you're provided with the user, and then you can write your business logic to return user-specific responses.
Cool. So just to get a little more clarity on this, and I'll admit I haven't done a whole lot with Passport.js because I don't write Express every day or JavaScript really every day. But you said it's middleware. So if I want a login screen or myself, you just manage the stuff coming back and forward. How many of the pieces do I get?
Yeah, absolutely. So you broke up a little bit there, but I think I can fill in the gaps from what you're saying. So so Passport.js is really focused on just authenticating the request. It's meant to be quite minimalistic, so it doesn't get involved in really any other areas of your application. So if you're writing your login screens and your front end code, that is all entirely up to the application developer with Passport.js.
Okay.
So you're free to pick, your templated language or, React, things like that, whatever your preference is on the front end. And Passport.js is just handling the back end components of those things. So if you're, just form posting your thing up in a login form, it'll handle that. If you're doing APIs, then your client side is responsible for putting the tokens in the request, and it'll parse those out of that and authenticate it that way. It's really, like I said, designed to be minimal and unobtrusive, which is important to me in things. I don't like frameworks that kind of really start to take over your application. So it's meant to just provide just that authentication bit and leave the rest of the choices that aren't and shouldn't be authentication related up to the developer.
So let's say that I want to authenticate against Google, right? Because you have all these authentication strategies. So I write my login page, I put the Google icon on there, I click it, and then what else do I have to do to make it work?
Yeah, so with Google, so if you go to passportjs.org, there's kind of tutorials that walk you through these various things. So one of the challenges, I'll get to your question in a minute, but just for some context here is one of the challenges with authentication is really there's so many ways to authenticate. And that's one of the things that Passport really tried to address, which is we got all these disparate ways to authenticate. How do we give sort of a single consistent way to drive that from within code? That being said, there are slight differences across these things. So for instance, one common way is just username and password, submit it via a login form. The developer has to do that. What you brought up is logging in with Google, for instance, via OpenID Connect or OAuth2, which has some kind of different semantics than just writing a login form. In particular, there's you got to redirect to Google and then handle a couple interactions there. So you do probably need to have a bit of background on kind of what the prerequisites are to set up, particularly with respect to your user interaction, because like I said, Passport is just a back-end framework. So there's tutorials on the website that will walk through these common scenarios. So in the case of Google, essentially what you would do is like you said, drop the Google button on your page, a user clicks it, and that will send a request back to your application, and you put the Passport middleware there. The Passport then will start to take over the OAuth flow, because that's really the thing you don't want to do as a developer. That's super complicated. So Passport will basically abstract all that away from you. So you just say passport.authenticate Google. And then Passport will take care of redirecting the user to Google, at which point like Google steps in and does the authentication, and then Google sends the user back to your application at, in this case, what's known as a redirect URI or a callback URI. And then here again, you just put the Passport middleware on that particular route in your Express application, and then Passport will finalize the OAuth or OpenID Connect interaction, and then just supply you the user that logged in. So it's really just basically kind of like in a hand wavy sort of sense, like 2 lines of code that you add as middleware at these 2 endpoints to handle the processing, and then a few more lines of code of just configuration to set up things like your client ID and secrets, credentials that Google issues you in order to use their system.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, I mostly do Ruby on Rails, and Warden is kind of the corollary there, right? And so, and then there's devices built on top of it, and that provides you with the views and things like that. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So just to kind of restate some of this, effectively, then I write the UI. I get the request. When I get the request into my application, I call into Passport. Passport does all of the juggling of wherever the authentication is happening, whether it's on my app or whether it's somewhere else. And then I get the authentication token or whatever other, credentials come back. And then from there, I marry that up to a user in my system. And then I can go and do whatever I need to with an authenticated user at that point.
Yes, 100%. Absolutely.
Cool. So what does it take to write something like this?
For me personally, or people dropping it in their application?
For you.
Yeah, so like I alluded to at the beginning, I'm a big kind of like identity nerd. I love the topic, so I'll just give some context here. So like I said, like Passport was started back in 2011, and I had been doing, this was kind of like the early era of like Web 2.0. So I got super fascinated by OpenID and OAuth and mashups and all that sort of stuff. And at that time, I guess I was just sort of like I had moved to the Bay Area and been here for about like 6 years doing a startup that was more kind of enterprise focused, and I was kind of looking for something new, and I wanted to get like more involved in open source development, maybe get something out there that had a bit of recognition behind it, and so that is kind of what I was looking to do. And so like Node was real early at the time, like I said, 0.2. And my background is more as a systems programmer, so C and C++. And when I took a look at Node, I was like, oh, this is super interesting. It's basically you're writing IO heavy applications, server applications. It's got all this event loop stuff in it with ePOL and whatnot. And it was like, I first took a look at Node, like the internals of Node, right? The C and C++ stuff that's going on internals. I was like, oh, that's super interesting. This is like a lot of the code I'm writing, but then they put this JavaScript layer on top, which just made it a lot easier to do, just your business logic. It's faster development and reasonably fast performance. And so that's kind of what drew me to Node. And then as I was looking into Node and like looking for maybe like an open source project to take on, and also very interested in security and identity, I was like, well, what's out there for authentication in the Node world? And I was familiar with things like Warden and Devise from Rails. And there wasn't really anything that existed at the time for Node. There was another project called EveryAuth, which I took a look at, but wasn't necessarily super happy with. And so I was like, oh, okay, like I'm gonna try my hand to make a authentication framework for Node and see what happens. And so really it was
how hard could it be, right?
Yeah, how hard could it be? And it was like like any developer, like I was looking for a challenge and something, it was hard but also fun, I guess.
Pre-promises it was so much harder than it needed to be, because
Yeah.
I mean, that triangle pyramid waterfall callback of doom thing, I mean,
Mhm.
that made it, I mean, back in those days, I looked through the Passport code. It was difficult to read because it's like callback, callback, callback. I mean, everything was back then. I'm not
Mhm.
by any means picking on it, but you know, especially because the OAuth flow. Yeah, I was trying to fix an issue with cookies way back in the early days, because back then most OAuth implementations require third-party cookies, but of course, you know, in the modern age that wouldn't work, and I imagine that it's, you know, that's been reworked since then. But
Mhm.
yeah, I was like trying to follow from this callback to that callback, and then like an event system. Those were tough days before promises. Those were really, really tough days.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like, that was like one of my kind of like experiences. At the time, I was also just learning JavaScript as I wrote some of this stuff. I had done a little bit, but nothing significant. And honestly, like I found JavaScript a little bit confusing, honestly, to at that point. And so like I was learning that at the same time, and as I said, like all the callbacks, any sort of like asynchronous IO where it's event driven can be hard to read, because it's, as you know, like not linear, but more driven over time, I guess, and you have to understand those sequences of events. So yeah, it was kind of one of the challenges of Passport, is like design an API that can take those challenges and make it somewhat tractable, and I think it's done a decent job of it. Obviously there can always be improvements. But so yeah, that's what I set out to do, and like kind of my premise was like that middleware pattern where it's just like passport.authenticate, and then using some strategies, and like that from a developer standpoint, like those are the kind of things that you just repeat over and over. It's just configure your strategies and then like throw the authentication middleware there. And reasonably, then I think that makes authentication, tractable and easy, and I think most people have used it to good effect. So that's kind of like the background there. And then, at the time, like I said, obviously Node was new, so I published Passport, the first initial versions of it, and spent a lot of time, just like Twitter was also kind of new at the time, so like anytime someone tweeted about Node or Auth, I'd reply to them. I'd get Stack Overflow, and just like a lot of community development and reaching out to people and telling them that the project exists, and did that for a while. And then it sort of just kind of grew its legs and took off from there. And now it gets, I don't know, couple million plus downloads a month from NPM or something like that.
Nice.
Yeah, just it's been interesting to watch a open source project kind of play out over a decade plus, and see how it's evolved. So yeah, it's been a great experience.
So one thing I want to call out that you mentioned, and this isn't specifically to Passport, but I talked to a number of open source developers, and they're like, look, I built this package, the people who use it love it, and I just can't seem to get people to find it. And it sounds, your strategy where you're talking about, hey, I just went on Twitter and just replied to people who were talking about Auth and JavaScript. That's a strategy that I've seen, in the podcasting space as well, right? Wherever somebody's talking about whatever topic you cover on your show, or if you have an episode that's relevant to it, right? You talk about it on Twitter or Facebook or wherever. So do you have a specific method for doing that, or?
No, no specific method other than just
Okay.
like reaching out and talking to people about it. I think like, that's one of the great things about how easy it is to just like communicate with people these days, and like everyone's connected online. So yeah, and also, like when you have a project like that, you're just super passionate about it, want to talk about it with people anyway, right? So yeah, I just reach out to anyone who seemed interested, or and like, especially when you're saying, hey, like check out this project, it's free, maybe it'll solve your problem. It's like you're really not asking them to do a whole lot.
Right.
So it's pretty easy to self-promote, I guess.
Yeah. So
no, I was going to say like the one other thing that I think I would encourage, like for people that are looking to kind of raise awareness of the things that they're doing, is the websites and some documentation. I think the other thing is like, I do for any project I wanted to promote. It just gives it a sort of like polished and professional, I'm sure, appearance if you can have a website and read the documentation, because that's one of the things that I think people struggle with in adoption. It's like a GitHub README will only go so far, especially if it's a somewhat bigger or more substantial project.
Yeah, I think we've all run into that, right? Where it's, hey, this package or this library or this product says it's going to solve my problem.
Mhm.
And you get in and you're trying to follow along in the documentation and you just can't figure out how to make all the pieces connect, right?
Yep.
And yeah, it's down to their documentation. It's like, look, this isn't comprehensive enough for me to figure out how to get the gears to mesh. And so I'm out of luck. And
Well,
yeah.
a lot of times on that, I mean, I would love to hear everybody's perspective on this, but I think the biggest issue with that is either A, not recognizing that the developer is not at where you're at. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of tools out there that people are asked to use that they're not necessarily a Node developer, a Python developer, whatever. And just having you need to have installed Node and you need to have, you know, done some other thing, create, run npm init or something like that. Like there's like
Mhm.
2 or 3 steps that you have to do with every single project that people often omit from their readmes, because it's like, well, duh, if you're one of these developers, you're going to know how to do that. But if you're coming to something where you're building a new project, and I would imagine that particularly with Passport, you observe this, is because people are not necessarily Node experts. They're like, oh, what's the easiest way to get an app together with this type of OAuth? And they end up on Passport. Or number 2
Yep.
would be that the examples are either too concrete or too abstract. And by that, I mean, it's difficult to tell which values are variables and which values are part of the framework's options. So like if everything's just foo, it can be difficult to tell, okay, which of these foos was supposed to be a URL? And if
Mhm.
everything is like exactly literal, then it's hard to tell, okay, am I roping into, for example, I know that Passport doesn't do this, but am I roping into Passport.com in order to run this thing, or is Passport.com just an example URL?
Mhm.
Well, let me play devil's advocate on you for once, AJ.
Oh,
Would you like
great.
to do it to us?
Great.
So you were talking about, making assumptions about this developer able to do this or that. One of the frustrating things for me that I read when I'm looking for a lot of Laravel, help on different things, and I'll come across blog posts all the time, and I swear 9 times out of 10, half of the blog post or 3/4 of the blog post is just getting a Laravel project up and running. Okay, install this, do this, create this, and I'm like, good Lord, just get to what the blog post is about, as if there's not a bazillion references elsewhere about, including the Laravel website, about how to get a basic Laravel project up and running. Don't pollute 3/4 of a blog post unless you're just trying to make it look longer than it really is, so you look better. But at some point,
Got to get them keywords.
but you got to make some assumptions about some basic knowledge at some point. If you're a developer, you can't, every blog post, every README is not going to have, 100 steps on how to just get to the point where you're ready to use this. And the internet's a big place. There's lots of tutorials on getting basic stuff up and running. And so as a user, if I'm, searching, oh, here's a blog post that the title says I'm going to talk about this, and it takes you 3/4 of the way through just to get to what they're talking about, and that's a tiny part of the blog post. And that'll tick me off, and I'll go away faster than anything else.
I 100% agree on that, but
Dang it. I wanted
I'm
you to
saying
disagree. Okay, sorry.
no, I'm just saying that like either a couple of bullet points, or like here's the 2 lines you copy and paste. Yes, if it's
Yeah.
like 100 steps to create a Laravel project, then yeah, the link to it, or
Right.
Yeah. One thing I want to add to that is just in Steve's example, the thing that always trips me up is here's the 3/4 of the thing that's boilerplate, but halfway through that 3/4 is a critical step.
Oh yeah.
Right? Because I'll skim it and I'll
Right.
go, oh, okay, I know all this stuff. And then it's, why isn't this working right? And so, yeah, hey, look, you need to take this step if you have an existing project, because you probably have an existing project. Jared, I kind of want to come back to the idea though, so it was documentation. I mean, obviously it was the right problem people needed to solve, but it was the documentation and the interaction that grew the project, right? Or are there other things that,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would say like certainly over the course of time. So I think one of my learnings here is just like, kind of maintaining an open source project for over 10 years, you start to see like more cycles come through. So like, I want to talk about this documentation a little bit. It's relevant to what you guys are all saying. So like in the early days, I set up the Passport website and some documentation, and the documentation was really probably a little bit more conceptual in nature, which was fine at those days. So think about like, again, like Node back in 0.2, 0.4, it's such, the pre 1.0 days, like Node itself was attracting sort of a different audience of developer. You had like very like leading edge developers who are willing to get in the bleeding edge and reading a lot of code. Like when I was writing Passport, I was reading a lot of code of other libraries at the time, just to understand the development. And I think that was common. Like a lot of the people that started using Passport, even though it made it relatively easy, I think they were, the type of developer that was willing to get in and read the code and the internals, like you were saying, AJ, whether they understood it all or not, you had people digging into it. And so like the documentation was a little bit more geared towards them. But like, as you think about this, as this scales just in like number of adopters and like over time, you start like Node has attracted different developers over time. Now it's much more of an established thing, like it's not bleeding edge anymore. People adopt it because they know that they can write stable applications in it. And you have developers that just kind of, maybe aren't going to read the code of the libraries that they pull in as dependencies and just want the documentation to be there. So I've evolved the website over time a lot as well to like add documentation, which has really helped a lot. So one of the frameworks that I used was, have you guys come across Diataxis? I'm not quite sure how you say it. It's like a documentation framework that's interesting. I'll send you guys a link at the end. We can put in the notes or whatever. But it's really talking about like, think about the challenges that you face as a developer. There's different challenges that you face in terms of like, you might be coming into something very new where you want just that step-by-step tutorial. So like on the Passport website, I have step-by-step tutorials for people who might not have ever used Node or Passport before. So it assumes some knowledge, like you have Node up and running, but you can follow just step-by-step. This is what you do to get auth in your thing. This is what you do like on an HTML page to add a login form. This is the type of route that you will add to your Express app. And it's just, you follow it step-by-step. You don't have to have any knowledge. And then at the end of it, you have a working sample application. There's also just more reference style documentation where it's like, hey, I just want to know like the APIs and that sort of stuff, the options. I just want to know what's there. I don't want to like follow a tutorial. And then there's like conceptual documentation, which is like, okay, I might have this thing running in my app, but now I need to know like, what's it actually doing? Like, what is this OAuth thing behind the scenes, which I, didn't have to know from the tutorial, but maybe I want to know it now that I'm, more experienced with my application and taking it to production. I want to know what problems I might face. So like different developers at different stages have different needs. So like writing documentation to those needs is really important. And I saw that like one of the kind of motivating factors for me to add some of that documentation to the website was just like the sheer number of GitHub issues being filed of like, things like you said, is like, okay, like I just pulled in this library and like tried to put it in my app. It's just not working. I don't know how to fit all the pieces together, right? Which is maybe not something I obviously would have like seen being the developer of it. I'm of course like too familiar with the details, so I don't necessarily think about those problems all the time. But then you start to see the influx of issues of people having them, and so like taking a step back and writing documentation that just kind of assumes very little knowledge about the system has like greatly reduced my own kind of support load. It just like cut those issues down because now there's just a tutorial to point to if someone has a question, or the questions often go away because they find the tutorial on their own. So it's just kind of a way to scale, I guess, my time or a maintainer's time.
Yep, makes sense. I kind of want to take us back to working on Passport.js and onto authentication. So let's talk a little bit about authentication here for a minute. So you get this basic functionality up where maybe it does OAuth or OpenID or something, and you can maybe bring some other strategies. When did the new strategies come in? Was that something that was there from the get-go, or was that something that?
Yep. Yeah, the strategies were there from the get-go. So I think like if I remember the evolution of this, basically like the first strategies were your typical like username and password, and then OAuth and OpenID, and I think it was like OAuth 1 and OpenID like
Right.
2.0 at the time. These are like, you know, technologies that have sort of faded over time. But yeah, the strategies were always central to the framework because like auth is so disparate, and I wanted a way to unify those things. I think the OAuth ones came like most of the initial Passport was done, like development was done within like a month or so. So like I think it was like I took 2 weeks to write like the framework and the first like
Nice.
login, like the username and password strategy. And then I think I added some like basic auth and like, you know, the API style authentication. And then I added the OAuth stuff, you know, all within the span of about a month, I think. But like the OAuth piece, like once that was working, I knew the framework sort of had what it needed to handle all the use cases. Because that's like, you know, that's a broad range of different functionality that you need to like accomplish auth, and it all sort of fit within this nice like strategy pattern and then middleware pattern, and I was pretty satisfied with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the larger question I'm trying to ask, because that kind of sets up, you know, okay, this is where we started, and this is kind of how things evolved as far as strategies went. But like, how has the problem set for authentication changed over the last 10 years that you've been working on this, right?
Yeah. So good question. I think authentication is one of those topics that is like constantly changing, and it seems like, you know, always something new to learn. Like I would say like one of the biggest changes has been like just the like single page applications and more front end focused stuff. And so like, and I'm not even sure like how to explain this stuff succinctly necessarily because it's still quite complicated. But you've just got so many different styles of application development, even within the scope of like web applications, right? So you've got your typical like traditional backend web applications where it's all HTML user interfaces and like login forms and session management, right? You've got like newer API style stuff where you just might be writing just JSON APIs and you don't care about any front end stuff. And then you've got, you know, single page applications and mobile applications accessing those APIs where like the login is done completely on the front end, somewhat disconnected from the back end, and you get like token based authentication. And there's a lot of similarities between those things, but also a lot of like key differences just in terms of like architectural stuff that you have to understand. And I would say like that to me has been the biggest change, is that these sort of like single page applications and mobile applications are like, you know, far more popular and predominant today than your traditional web application, and sort of like understanding those differences has been the biggest challenge. Looking forward a little bit more, and this is stuff I'm excited about, but you have things like WebAuthn happening now, and there's some kind of newer work that's out there to do to make sessions a little bit more secure. So we can talk about that if you want, but more things like token binding so that things are actually tied to the device and not just bearer tokens. These are the areas that authentication is pushing into that are hot topics and challenges today.
So I'm very interested in where WebAuthn is going. My understanding is that is the rebrand of Fido. So like,
Yes.
and this stuff is changing like super fast now. For a long time, these things were kind of stagnant, but now Windows Hello is integrating it, Mac OS is integrating it, and then the browsers are also integrating it, which sometimes starts to get confusing because there's like multiple layers of WebAuthn.
Yes.
Yeah. So like what have you seen in WebAuthn, and where is it headed? Is it actually, I mean, it seems like it's gotten to the point where all I have to do is just hit OK because of the operating system integration. And at that point I'm thinking, okay, is this actually more secure, or did we just get rid of the whole thing? The security of
No, it's fascinating. I mean, it does feel like magic at times, especially with the stuff that you're talking about, like with Windows Hello and, you know, like Touch ID and Face ID on Mac now. So
yeah, but it's nice that it feels like magic, because if I don't want to fight it, right?
Mhm.
I can just reach for something like Passport and not have to worry about it until I have to worry about it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other thing, like, yeah, and when I say magic, I don't mean that in any sort of like derogatory sense. I think like WebAuthn and technologies like that are both more secure and easier to use, which is like a very rare thing to happen in the security environment. Usually, like making something more secure makes it harder to use.
Which
And we're
then
sort of,
makes it less secure because
yeah,
then there's
because
more
no one,
loopholes where
for
people
sure.
Yeah.
go around
Now
it.
the hoop I have to jump through is on fire.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So yeah, so I think like some context here. You said like WebAuthn is kind of the rebrand of FIDO, which is more or less true. FIDO is actually like the organization that started doing the protocols for like how you talk to the hardware. So that YubiKey that you held up, like the USB protocols, how all that hardware to hardware stuff happens at a low level. And they did some initial like JavaScript work, but they took their JavaScript work to the W3C, and that's where WebAuthn happened. So it's kind of like WebAuthn and FIDO are married together in some sense. But some of the early work there on FIDO is like all based on like hardware security tokens for the most part, right? So it's like you got your FIDO device that you plug in, or it might be built into your computer, and it makes it super secure and phishing resistant. But one of the sort of things that happens as an implication of that when you have hardware-based devices for login is like, what happens if you lose that device, right? So if I've got my FIDO key and my laptop and I've got both of those registered, but like the FIDO key is plugged into the laptop and my laptop gets stolen or lost or whatever, I have no hardware devices left, right? So how do I get into my accounts? And that's not necessarily in the strictest sense like an authentication problem, but because authentication is such a cross-cutting concern, you get into these other issues pretty quickly, maybe without you even realizing it. So think about a developer, they might just say, oh, like FIDO's the latest thing, it's the most secure, implement that. Now you've got a customer that calls you up on the phone being like, I can't log in anymore because I only had FIDO credentials. Like, what do I do, right? And
I have
so,
never seen that in the wild though. That's like
well,
the crypto nerd's dream, but it's like
yeah. So
FIDO is never except now that the I was it iCloud keychain. iCloud keychain
yeah,
is now integrated. Actually, I take it back. Since
yeah,
iCloud keychain has been integrated, I think that a few providers have actually been adding it as the first method. But then
yeah,
you're away from the hardware. It's
yes.
virtualizing the hardware through the software in the cloud.
Yeah, 100%. So that's kind of where I was going with that, right? So it's like you have this recovery problem statement. So like, how do you solve that recovery problem statement? And like Apple kind of really led the charge here, as you noted with iCloud, where they basically said, okay, look, we'll basically make these FIDO style keys, these WebAuthn keys, but we will sync them on iCloud so they sync across the devices. So if you register it on your phone, it'll sync to your laptop. And as long as you can like log into your iCloud account, you can get a new device and it'll sync there. So there's obviously some wrinkles here, and we can like poke at it, of course. But it does sort of nicely solve the recovery problem if you're willing to accept that like iCloud is a sufficient recovery mechanism for you, right? And like that begs its own questions, but like more than likely someone's going to remember their iCloud password so that they can set up a new device, whereas they might not remember like the random recovery password for a site that they don't use too frequently. So yeah, like I said, trade-offs there, but like that
So
was sort of the
that's
turning point with WebAuthn is once they introduced these what they call passkeys now, which are these syncable credentials that go across device. Now it kind of opens up the room for adoption and to make that magical experience where not only is the authentication easy, but like the recovery and the sort of your disaster scenarios are also tractable as well.
it feels like we've come full circle back to OAuth though, because now it's like iCloud is the new OAuth. If you're using iCloud or Windows Hello is the new OAuth. So now rather than registering through Facebook, which I think Facebook, I could be wrong, I think they're in massive decline. So I think most sites are either Apple login or Google login right now. And then if you're on a business tool like an Outlook or whatever, it's got the Microsoft login. But it seems like the social login is being replaced with an operating system login that, once you squint right and erase some of the magic, it's just OAuth again.
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from there. Like, that's a topic we could go in for a long time. I think it'll be interesting to see how this trend plays out. Like, it's from a user's sort of experience, it's very much the same. It's like, okay, like I either see like a connect with Google button and I click it and do the OAuth dance, or I see like a login with passkey button and I click that and then do the passkey prompt thing. So it's very much just kind of a one-click login from a user's experience. There's a couple technical differences underneath the hood that I think are super important to point out. One, like with OAuth, there's a lot of privacy concerns in the sense that like the provider you use for OAuth sees a lot of your activity, all the sites that you log into, et cetera. Which, you know, I'm not going to say good, bad, or indifferent there, but like it's something that you have to be aware of. With WebAuthn, even though your credentials might all be synced through iCloud, so you're sort of reliant on Apple if that's your provider of choice. Apple doesn't see all that activity. Like if I log in with WebAuthn and use my iPhone to do it on every site, I can log into every site on the internet with that, and Apple doesn't know that I have done that. So there's a lot of big privacy wins there.
Is that true?
Yeah, that's definitely true.
How?
Yep.
Apple also wrote the OS, so if they are spying on it, there are other ways they could do it already.
Yeah, that's my question, is because if you control the whole chain of software, saying that it's end-to-end encrypted, we don't look pinky promise. I don't know if I trust that.
Sure. Like obviously, if we're looking full stack, Apple writes the browser, et cetera. Like Google does that too. So there's lots of insertion points by which they can like monitor things. I'm strictly speaking from the authentication sense here, right?
Like, you wouldn't have
like
Google
in the OAuth,
Facebook in the middle.
Yeah, in the OAuth world, like you have them in the middle, and they can see your activity by virtue of just that single like protocol. OAuth here, like that layer alone gives them that activity. Now, WebAuthn eliminates that, and we can talk about how if you're interested. Of course, there's other layers in the whole stack to make it work, which like things could be happening, but at least at the authentication layer, there's more privacy guarantees. The other trend I think that's like interesting to watch here is just like how that interaction model evolves. Like as these things change, is like there's a lot more development in like wallet style interactions and things like verifiable credentials, where a lot of the patterns that you see with OAuth in terms of like granting access to something or proving that like you're a certain person or have certain characteristics, you can start to shift to more of these like wallet style interactions where like my transactions with another third party are just kind of point to point, and there's a lot of like privacy benefits to that that shifted out of like your typical identity provider model where there's a third person in the middle. So like these things are all happening, and I think it's like quite interesting. They ultimately lead to like very similar user experiences, but very different sort of like technical and architectural implications here.
So just kind of coming back to authentication with JavaScript, maybe using Passport, are these things that Passport currently has strategies for, or are these things you're looking at?
To some level of development
affect your job too is the other question I have.
So Passport's been like a good framework to evolve here. So like the strategies have been there from the beginning. So like WebAuthn didn't obviously exist at the time Passport was written, but because the strategy mechanism is flexible, you can implement strategies that do this. So Passport does have a WebAuthn strategy that's workable today. There's some that WebAuthn is like in development, and like lots of kind of new features happening constantly as the W3C and the browser vendors sort that stuff out. So there's some features that probably aren't yet implemented in the Passport strategy, but I've got my eye on them, and I know other people have some pull requests out there for them. So that's a work in progress. But you can get started on it today. For things that are further out in the horizon, the things I mentioned, like verifiable credentials, those are much more experimental today. So there's not a strategy out there for them that I know of anyway, but it's certainly doable and something that like I kind of play around with in the background. So if and when those things become adoptable, there'll be a strategy for those as well.
So it's more a question of like maturity of the technology and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the benefits of like that strategy pattern, like, kind of one of the things I try to do with Passport is make it like an open ecosystem. So like there's now, I don't know, well over 500 strategies. It might be approaching close to 1,000. I kind of quit counting at a certain point. But like lots of developers publish strategies for tons of different authenticate ways of doing authentication. And it's, permissionless in the sense of like, anyone can do it, and the API is there for you to do it. I myself at the beginning kind of wrote like 50 or so of the initial strategies, so you can see how it took off from there. But like, as these technologies, like I know people who like pursue some of these more experimental technologies who will write a passport strategy as a way of like proving that it's implementable, or show that it's real. And then as those technologies can succeed or fail on their own merits, but passport can support.
So another question that I have, Passport it's old, right? I mean, like you said, it started in the 0.2 days. I imagine it's probably gone through a major refactor or two as JavaScript has evolved to have native crypto primitives and promises and stuff like that. But us old dogs and anybody sensible is using Express because it's just simpler, right? And it's dead. And dead things don't change, they don't break on you. But it's not cool, it's not hip, it's not making any headlines. If Express 5 finally releases after what's it been 7 years in beta now, no one will probably care. So with the future of Passport, are you making it available for or adaptations of it, or a different version of it for things like Fastify, or what's that? I'm forgetting the name of the one that we had on just a few weeks ago. Can somebody help me? What was it called? It's one that's written for Bun, but it works in Node as well. Elise, is it Elise?
Elysia.
Elysia. Okay, Elysia. You got Bun, you got Dino. Are you just saying like this is tried, it's true, it's stable? People that want that are going to have this, or are you doing anything to play towards the younger crowd?
I'm probably more on the former. Like it's kind of tried, it's true, it's stable. I think like Express might be old and not cool anymore, but like I've also gotten old and not cool anymore too. So I'm maybe okay with that. Yeah, I guess I'm one of those people who like, I like stable technology. I like boring technology, and like something that works.
Says the man who was in Node 0.2.
Yeah, well, sure, fair enough. Yeah, there's always going to be something new. I think that's like part of what makes technology development exciting. But like, also, I'm not one to break things that are working well either. So I'll talk to that a little bit, like specifically. So with the Passport, there's a notion, although it doesn't really get like talked about too much or probably leveraged all that often, of like having different like frameworks that you can like plug in underneath it. So like this is more of an internal thing, but like Passport, in the way it sort of like dispatches its authentication handling out to like the containing web framework, if you will, is somewhat pluggable. So like it sort of defers to Express and calls Express specific stuff, but you can swap in other frameworks if you want to. And like back in the day, again, this is going to be like old stuff, but like that was leveraged by Happy, if people remember that.
Oh,
that
okay.
And I think that probably doesn't get used as much anymore. But I know people have used that similar technique. Like there's ways to use it in Next.js. I've played around with it in Fastify too as like an experiment. I'm not sure if it like gets widely used in that ecosystem. But this is something that's always on the back of my mind, is like, okay, like Passport can be made to play with these frameworks in a better way. It's never quite reached the level of priority where I'm like, okay, like I'm going to really like stabilize this pattern and promote it. It just doesn't, seem to have that people asking for it, demanding it that much. But as I like play with things and refactor on my own time, that's something that's always there. And like maybe at some point I'll get interested enough in one of these alternative frameworks to prove out and show people how it can be done. But otherwise, I'm pretty satisfied with where it is. Yeah, I think, yeah, just to reiterate, like it's stable, and I feel no need to break it. If I wanted to jump to like a completely different framework, I'd probably look at doing it in completely new JavaScript style and that sort of stuff. Like, the JavaScript world has evolved, and like things like Winter CG and stuff like that, I think are worth paying attention to, and kind of like changing what it means to write like portable packages. But I don't like, there's just a long tail of historical packages that will probably like never make that move. And I don't know what that does over time, but you know, that's just kind of like, you gotta know your history, I guess, for some of these things, you know.
Yep. So I was also thinking, and this is a question I like to ask just in general, is, okay, well, what's the other, I guess, major alternative to this? And the thing that I'm coming up with, and you said you work for them, is Okta, or Auth0, which is owned by Okta now.
Yep.
And so when would you pick one and when would you pick the other? Because I've used both, or at least both strategies, right? I've used the Warden strategy for my Rails apps, and I've used Okta, and sometimes it made sense, and sometimes one of them caused me way too much pain, and I moved to the other. And so in your estimation, yeah, when do I start thinking, okay, am I going to get a done for you, or am I going to do it myself?
Yeah, so good question. I'll give some background here. So like, I worked at, so Passport started in like, you know, like I said, 2011, 2012. And I joined Auth0 and I think like early 2015, like shortly, maybe like a year after it got started. I was pretty early there. And you know, Auth0 was like a big proponent of Passport and promoted Passport, and also like Passport works well with Auth0. So I view these things as like really symbiotic in a way.
Okay.
And I'll talk about that, what that means. But basically, like, so if you look at Passport, it's trying to solve the authentication problem generally, right? So there's always this notion of, okay, like you can build everything yourself, right? So like if you want to build your own login forms and all that sort of stuff, like go for it. And a lot of people do and consider that something that's important to them. And I don't think I'd ever, at this point, like try to talk you out of it if that's something that you wanted to do. That being said, I think one of the things that's important to understand as you like build authentication is you end up tackling a lot of problems that aren't just authentication, right? Like you might start saying, okay, I'm going to build my own login form, but now you've got to, you know, hash your passwords and like, you know, keep your hashes up to date. You've got recovery problem statements, like how do you email people like password reset links? You've got rate limiting problem statements if you get to any scale and people start to attack you. And there's just all these sort of problems that like you might not know at the outset, but that eventually you run into, right? And it's not just about authentication, but it's about all the stuff around it. And so that's really like the premise of using a service like Auth0 or Okta, which is, okay, like, you know, you want to build an application, you need authentication. That entails a whole bunch of stuff that you really probably don't want to do if you're, you know, going to have any like significant traction in the market. So just kind of like outsource that, right? And so like that's the value of using a system that way. And I think it's probably recommended for those people who are, you know, intending to launch like a widely deployed application. That being said, even when you choose to use Auth0, for example, you still have to do authentication problem statements in your own application, right? So one of the ways of using Auth0 is just like talk to Auth0 via OpenID Connect. So Auth0 becomes like your identity server, but your application needs to speak OpenID Connect to it in order to authenticate people. So it's like, yes, Auth0 is doing the authentication, but you might drop Passport in via the OpenID Connect strategy to have your application kind of authenticate against Auth0. Similarly, like you might be building APIs and like Auth0 is issuing the tokens for those APIs, but you need to authenticate them in your own application. So authentication exists on like both sides of the wire, right? So it's like you might build it all yourself and you can use Passport as like one piece in your toolkit to do it. But really, you shouldn't have to build it all yourself, but you still have to handle authentication bits in your own application, even though you've outsourced most of it. So you can use them together as well.
Cool. I want to be mindful of time, but I think we've got a few more minutes if somebody else has something they want to go into, or if there's something we didn't cover, Jared.
No, this has been great. Your questions are awesome.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not much of a Node.js user, Heretic, I know, but so I
I'm
let
right
the
there with
smarter
you.
people ask the questions. I mean, I
All
will
right.
say this, that I mean, in my experience dealing with authentication, listening to other people talk with it, it's not some road I want to go down. I like to be able to, some of the distributions that I use have a lot of that built in for me, whether it's simple stuff or something more complex. And it's just nice when I can start up an app and not have to deal with that. I just know that my users can be authenticated and I'm not having to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So amen to people like you that do that for me.
You're welcome.
All
What
right.
about you,
Well,
AJ? Like,
yeah.
what problems do you see like on authentication? I'm always curious to like, people who are in the weeds on this stuff, like what are the challenges you're facing these days?
I don't know. I having, as far as I know, well, I haven't really looked. I've been building something incrementally for a few different clients, but having the ability for people to have their own single sign-on and having having more like a library for authentication than something that's frameworky. The reason for that being that if you're building it rather than using Okta, there's something special that you care about that you need to tweak, and the more that's abstracted away, the more difficult it is to find the area to do the whatever it is that the tweak needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's something I've got a little project that I've used in a few places over a few iterations, and I've tentatively called it lib off, because the idea is that it's at some point I'll have like a lib auth init, and lib auth init will write out the routes and it'll have a lot of boilerplate in it. So if you need to go tweak something, you'll go tweak the boilerplate rather than having it abstracted into a single function where you have to re-implement the strategy to move those few things around to track it in a different way or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not building a lot of new applications, so I'm not dealing with auth often. But those are kind of the two things. Is as a company gets larger, they want other companies to be able to integrate with their API, and so then they need a single sign-on for themselves to export out.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like I said, just where is the middle ground to export the primitives? And in some ways it starts to feel like, oh, well, these functions are so small and so tiny you could just implement them, but then it's all those little bits over and over again. Your function would end up being 100 lines long.
Mm-hmm.
But if so it's like, where's that nice middle ground where it's not just abstracting away trivial things that, granted, end up being 100 lines long if you don't abstract them away, but you're also not abstracting away the meat and potatoes to the point where you have to copy, paste, and publish a new strategy.
Yeah, no, I track exactly what you're saying there. I think that points to like why authentication is so interesting, kind of challenging. It's such a cross-cutting concern in an application, and a lot of people have very like specific requirements they have when they want it. And you touched on like something there, which is like, okay, you've got your clients, and what they really want to do is like provide SSO and access to their own API. So it's kind of like at that point they want to be their own OAuth server, effectively, right? Which is a common thing that companies do as they grow. But it's, in my view, even though these things are related, that you're moving from authentication into more like authorization problem statements, and you get like a lot more things around like, oh, how do I prompt my user for consent, and like, scopes. I need to present them dialogues to say what they're granting access to in a way that's understandable, and that gets to be like, now you're deep into like kind of the domain model of the application itself at that point, at some layer, right?
And also, you talked earlier about the SPA stuff. So this auth library, that the result of it today, I've started it over a few times, but almost every single time I've hunkered down and been like, okay, I'm really going to flesh this thing out and I'm going to make it into a real thing. The next day is, major update to browsers. Iframes no longer supported.
Yes.
Right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, so now we can't have seamless authentication anymore because of clickjacking, whatever. All right. So, okay, scrap this, come back to it a couple years later. All right, I'm gonna write this thing again. Then, like literally I'm almost done. And Firefox, Safari, and all other browsers except for Google no longer allow third-party cookies starting next month. And it's like, oh, well, that's not gonna work. So that's kind of one of the frustrating things is the primitives that allowed us to make authentication seamless keep on getting removed. The buggy things don't get better. I mean, I think that we still have that problem. If you're on an iPhone web view, if you call window.close, it doesn't close. You can't redirect. And so then like the user, so like the things that were easy are getting removed, and the things that are blocking us from having a seamless experience, those bugs aren't actually getting fixed. And it's like every couple of years there's some major change to the way that browsers work between third parties.
I think that speaks to the sort of like interplay between effectively like front end or client side authentication concerns and like back-end server-side concerns. And like I guess fortunately in the case of Passport.js, I like really focused on the back-end concerns itself, right? And like kept all the client-side stuff out of it, and that's been scalable and evolvable in a relatively sustainable way. But to your point, like maybe makes the developer do more of the front-end stuff themselves, right? It's less abstracted.
But that front end stuff, it's all broken. Like any strategy that you ever would have tried to do this stuff on the front end, it's all broken over the last 10 years. Like there's been
for sure.
So it turns out that the only thing that has reliably worked over the last decade has been put the whole thing on the back end.
Yeah. And I think that is probably like still the trend. Like in my own kind of like ideal world, I've often toyed with like kind of marrying like Passport or any really backend auth framework with like a seamless like front end framework. I think that'd be interesting, like from my identity nerd type of standpoint. Like that's a challenge that would be fun to solve. But to your point, like I've took stabs at it like here and there over the years, but I've never really felt satisfied with like the level of abstraction that could be achieved and making it like DevX friendly. So I still think there's like room out there to like improve the front end side of things and then integrate it nicely with the back.
Are you aware of the portal spec?
Portal spec? No, I have not come across this.
We will see whether or not this is ever implemented. And by implemented, like my thought is basically on the front end, if you're a responsible developer, you shouldn't be using anything that hasn't been around for 2 years. Unless I mean, that's not entirely true, because a lot of times you can bet on the future, and by the time your product rolls out, that thing has been available for 2 years. But a lot of times it's already been deprecated or taken off of the standards track within 2 years. So that's where it's like, and then you end up with the Babel story where for the rest of time and eternity, you have to either use Babel or you have to use something like back in the WebSocket days, what was that one called? The super popular WebSocket framework.
Socket.io.
Socket.io, right? Like Socket.io still implements like an iframe strategy, or they may have removed it, but like you end up with that kind of thing. So portals, if it actually comes to fruition, my understanding is that will be a secure iframe where the iframe changes the URL in the URL bar. So a portal pops up like a modal. When you click into the portal, the URL changes in the URL bar, and then you have the ability to expand the portal to take up the whole screen and potentially some sort of CSS transition so that you could do, for example, an OAuth flow without a redirect. You open up a portal, like opening up an iframe, but the portal takes over the URL bar. And then when the portal goes away, the URL bar goes back. So it almost looks like, in all respects, a redirect, except that the redirect never happens. The state of the application in the background, like the
Okay.
form that you were halfway through filling out or whatever, stays while the flow in the foreground happens.
Yep.
And it sounds really, really promising if they figure out how to do CSS transitions so that it'll work the way that people want to, which it sounds like it probably will, because I think they're already doing CSS transitions for redirects now. If I remember correctly, there's some sort of spec to basically say you can have a CSS transition that if you load a new page, the new page will load with the transition. It'll feel like a single page application on multi-page. But that's something I've got my fingers crossed for, because it essentially solves all the problems. It solves the security concerns. It solves the state management concern. If portals land, it will be the perfect tool for seamless authentication. We'll finally have what we had back in the 2000s without the click jacking, until somebody figures out how to do the click jacking, and then we'll lose it again. I don't know.
Yeah. That sounds promising. I mean, that state management problem is like one of the things that is always like hung up like OAuth adoption, and like SPAs in particular, is like you redirect and you lose all your state that's sitting there in the browser, and then you got to like reconstitute that on the redirect back, and it never works right. So
which would totally be fine if we could use the pop-ups, except we can't use the pop-ups because they don't work on mobile.
Yep.
All right. I'm going to push us to picks just in the interest of time. Before we do that, though, Jared, if people have questions or if they want to, follow anything else you're doing, where do people find you online?
Yeah. So Jared Hanson is my handle pretty much everywhere on Twitter /X, GitHub. You can go to passport.js.org and everything will be linked from there. So yeah, check it out. Shoot me questions.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's do some picks. Steve, you want to start us with picks?
Yes, I will start with picks. And I actually have a couple lower level picks before we get to the high point of the podcast. News breaking today, as of this recording, that would be a rather large issue in the design community, is that Figma and Adobe have bailed on their merger. The top of Hacker News, Dylan Field, who's the CEO of Figma, put out a blog post and basically said there was just too many regulatory hurdles. And so they have bailed. And I think, if I remember correctly, the number was something like $20 billion merger.
Oh, wow.
It was pretty huge. And I remember hearing a lot of designers saying, all right, Adobe's going to screw up Figma now. I'm getting out of Figma. I'm going to something else. So it'll be interesting to see if I'd be curious to see, number one, how many people actually did leave Figma, and two, how many people come back after this. So that was some interesting news. And then in the burgeoning and very important world of interior design for automobiles, this sort of struck me because I've seen this happen elsewhere too. There's a story on the Drive about how with the newest designs, Volkswagen has really got a lot of pushback because in the interiors, they've gotten rid of tactile physical buttons and everything's been on touchscreens. And so when things don't work, a lot of the time people get really frustrated, which is pretty common. And so what they have said is they're going to go back to using actual buttons for a number of features within the car. And I saw the same thing recently from Hyundai as well. Their chief designer had said he's going to keep using buttons because people are used to them and they actually work. You don't run into a lot of the issues that you do with touch screens on digital displays. For me, myself, my vehicle has some stuff on the touch screens, but there's some stuff that you can actually do with physical buttons in my truck, and it's really nice to have that. So
frustrating to try to adjust the temperature and have to like deal with a flipping touch screen when you're driving. It's like, just give me the flipping knob. Like, come on.
Well, a knob, or even mine has a couple up and down buttons that you can push pretty easily as well. So yeah, it's one of those cases where you see the pendulum swing one way and then it's coming back because people realize maybe this one way isn't all it's cracked up to be. So interesting. And
I
then
experienced that on we got a new oven, and they have digital buttons to set the temperature. So you turn it to bake and then you hit temp and then yeah, it's most of the time it works, and every once in a while I'm practically breaking my finger on the UI trying to get it to read that I hit the 3.
And probably
Or
breaking
something.
the UI itself because you're pushing so hard, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Time for the dad jokes of the day. And those of you dad joke aficionados will be happy to hear that I have my rim shot back. So that will enhance.
I've been practicing for these. Oh, anyway, go ahead.
Yes, Jared, you can either laugh or groan. All responses are welcomed. Sort of a simple one today. What did the sushi say to the bee? Wasabi. Right. So for those of you who may be a fan of the Budweiser Was Up commercials from 20 years ago, there's a great one about wasabi. Just Google Budweiser wasabi and you'll see it. So recently for my son's birthday, I got him a sort of a simple gift. I got him an alarm clock, but it swears at him instead of beeping. So he's in for a rude awakening. Right. And then finally, I've talked about some of the jobs that I've had in the past that I get fired from, and, working at the typewriter keyboard factory and taking off too many shifts and that kind of stuff. But one of my first jobs was posing like a mannequin in a clothing store window. I held that position for a long time. Thank you. Those are my picks.
All right. AJ,
And we did have some silent chuckles just for
Yes.
the listener only audience.
Yes. Very silent.
Even Jared was, having a moment
on one of those. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a technical pick for the first time in a long time. I think it's been a while since I picked a JavaScript library, but recently, there's this old application that I'm working on, and it gives me so much anxiety. It's so fragile. It's been getting better and better over the years. We've refactored a lot out of it, but there's just times when I'm scared to push to production. And a tool that I found recently, as I'm trying to gradually add types to it so that I can feel more and more confident, I found a couple of tools. One is MySQL Schema TS and Postgres Schema TS that will read, you connect to the database, it'll read the current state of the database, not what's in the migrations, which may not reflect what somebody did as a hotfix. So it'll read the actual state of the database and output TypeScript interfaces. And then there's another package, TS to JS doc, which will translate from those, whichever tables, or if you've selected the whole schema, will go through and then read the TypeScript definitions and then translate them to JS doc. And so then you can mark your types. And I have not been able to get objection to work with the TypeScript checker in JavaScript. I hear rumor that the latest version might work if you use it with TypeScript, or maybe the latest version would work if you use it with JavaScript, but we're pinned to the version that we're pinned to. But anyway, so those two tools have helped me and helped me find a few bugs, because I can basically manually overwrite a call to the database and say, ignore what you think the type is that's being returned, that you're reading from the ORM. Instead, this is the type that's being returned. And so those two tools have been really helpful for me. And if you're interested in either starting new projects using JavaScript with types, or you are trying to migrate a project to incrementally add type checking, I did a presentation on this. It's up at jswithtypes.com. And there's a little npm module that you can run npm init, and it will do the magical incantations that will make it so that you can use the TypeScript checker in JavaScript, which there's a lot of blogs out there about this, but there's a lot of, I don't know, there's like a lot of little details. And if you want to get the TypeScript checker working with JavaScript, it's it's deceptively not easy. It seems like it should be straightforward. It seems like, oh, I'll just, set JavaScript types to true in the config file, and this should work. But there's like a number of things that you have to do that are not intuitive, and they're difficult to explain. So if you run the npx jswt init, it will just do the right thing. Or if your project is set up in a particularly weird way, it'll, you can at least open up the config file and hopefully see you need to change your lib directory name or whatever. So I've been a huge fan. I hope this has come across on the show. I'm a huge fan of JavaScript and types. Huge fan. I wish there were simpler ways to do it. I wish there were better tools for it. But I love JavaScript's native type system. I think it's amazing. I don't think it's perfect. I don't really think it's amazing. I think it's workable. I think it's very, very workable. Not amazing at all, because it wasn't designed to be a type system. But JavaScript has types, and we can use those to our advantage. We don't have to pretend like double equals is the rule. Double equals is not even an exception. It's not an acceptable option. We can use strict, strong typing in JavaScript. And after all, I mean, even if you're using a language like C, I would say that C is very weakly typed. The types are in the tooling. If you have bad tooling, you have bad types. If you have good tooling, you have good types. And the TSC, the TypeScript checker, is certainly acceptable and will help you have a better experience with JavaScript. Other picks, a little quicker, hopefully. But I came across these speakers. So I had this issue where, I mean, it's just, the world is falling apart. I'm going to refer back to Jonathan Blow's talk, preventing the collapse of civilization, right? Like, things that seem like they should work because we're more advanced now don't. I had these Bluetooth speakers. They would literally cause my Mac to eventually, the Bluetooth audio model would kernel panic, and then audio would stop working without a reboot. It could be that the Bluetooth speakers, they were, fairly cheap speakers from a no-name brand, right? So it could be that the speakers were just bad, but shouldn't the kernel be more resilient against malicious hardware? I mean, isn't that like the kernel's job, is like, hey, you're malicious hardware, or your hardware that doesn't follow the spec properly, your reset. No, like, instead the kernel resets. And so I bought a new pair of speakers, and they're the Creative T60s. And they're larger than I thought they were going to be. And in my mind, they were probably about a quarter the size of what they really are. They are about the size of a Nintendo Switch. Well, bigger than that on just the face of them. Yeah, about that size on the face of them. And then they're, what are they about the size of? If you go back, because they're not thin like that. But anyway. But they ended up being bigger, but the sound quality is actually really, really good. And they connect via Bluetooth, which I have not tried, and I don't want to try, but they also connect via USB-C, which, when I did the swap between these and the other speakers that were messing up, literally caused the computer to restart. I don't know what's happening with the Mac operating system, but it's not good. Anyway, but they sound really good. Like, they have an amazing soundstage, and they were $65. Like, I'm an audio snob. But these, they actually sound good. My only complaint is that because I'm using them via USB-C, because most people could probably just plug them in with the 3.5 millimeter cable and be fine. But because I'm plugging them in with USB-C, I lose a volume control. So I have to use the Loopback app to make a virtual audio device that outputs to the speakers, set my system output to the virtual audio device, and now I have volume control on the keyboard again. Why that can't be just done in macOS, I don't know. But the speakers themselves, they have the Bluetooth option, the USB-C option, and the 3.5 millimeter option. And they sound so much better than I would have expected at $65. So Creative has done it again. I just, huge shout out to them for, again, it's the Creative T60s. And then, okay, I'll be fast on these ones. I promise. I promise. I talked about the Hammerhead metal shower head a few weeks back. our other shower head in our other bathroom broke. So I bought another one. So I brought it back to my remembers. So easy to install, and I have no doubt that it will last at least as long as I do, or at least as long as the house does. So if you have shower head holders breaking, because they're the silly plastic ones that ship with every single shower head, which no shower head manufacturer provides as a replacement part on their website, because they really don't give a darn about their eco-friendly blah 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 blah, save the planet blah 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 blah. They just want you to buy new shower heads. The hammerhead metal shower head will save you, and you'll never have to buy another shower head holder again. And then my wife has fallen in love with me all over again, because I bought a Degrees of Comfort King dual heated blanket for the winter, because I can't stand the house being hot. She wants the house to be like 100 degrees. And I'm like, it's winter. It's okay. The house can be cold. And I bought this blanket for us, and it's dual heated. So each side you can pick, how warm you want it. So I can turn my side off. I could turn it on when I'm just getting into bed, and then turn it off when I'm about to go to sleep. And she can leave her side on all night long. And this is working out great. And she tells me every single day that she loves it. So yeah, and it's got good ratings, and I looked through dozens of them before picking one, and I feel pretty confident that it's probably the best one that I could have gotten. So I'll give a link to that. So those are my picks.
All right, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to be really, really brief. I always do a game pick. The one that I've been playing lately, I've picked it before, is Risk Legacy. Board Game Geek weight of 2.59, which means that it's a little bit more complicated than the average gamer wants to play. But if you're a fan of Risk, it's actually, the games go faster, and it's a lot of fun. So I do have to say, my friends, after I won the first 2 games, they ganged up on me. So that happens, right? Anyway, a couple of other picks. We're going to be doing a few things different. One of them is we're going to tweet out before we go live every week. So keep an eye on that. You can follow us as JS Jabber on Twitter. You can find a Facebook page. The YouTube channel is Top End Devs. And you can go check all that out. And then in addition to that, we're putting up the premium version of the podcast, which just doesn't have the ads in it. But a bonus I decided I was going to add was that if you want to help us decide what to talk about, right? So it's like, hey, so-and-so would be a good guest, or hey, I'm learning about this topic and I think you ought to talk about it on the show, right? So maybe you go try out WebAuthn and it's like, I want to learn more about WebAuthn. Is there a WebAuthn guy, And turns out, yeah, I probably do. So we'll get that lined up. And I'm going to be doing those once a month. And all you have to have is that premium level. Now, I'm also putting together videos, for weekly videos on training, kind of like what Railscast used to do for Rails, except it's going to be JavaScript focused. I'm also doing a React series. And then we're going to have JavaScript Geniuses, which is going to be 3 meetups per month. They'll all be at the same time of day, same day every week. And we're probably going to have an expert one week. We'll do a Q&A one week. We'll kind of do a workshop or live coding or something else the other week. And then it also includes a meetup with the rest of them, the Ruby Geniuses and the React Geniuses, where we talk about career stuff, right? So tools, careers, things that are not specific to a language or framework. So you definitely go check all those out. And then I'm also finally working on the How to Get a Programmer Job book. I released it a while back, but there were some updates I wanted to make to it. And so that'll come out next year. And I'm self-publishing it, so you'll be able to just get it on Amazon or off of the website. Jared, what are your picks?
Picks. So I recently moved into a new house, so I've been kind of setting up new house stuff. The pick I will throw out is Ubiquiti's networking gear. If anyone's looking for like house Wi-Fi networking gear, it's pretty nice equipment that I've enjoyed setting up.
Nice.
I've heard that recommended rather ubiquitously whenever I look for networking gear.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, highly recommended. Slick, works well, easy to configure. Nice stuff.
All right. Well, thanks for coming, Jared. This was fun.
Thanks for having me.
It's always interesting to dive into this stuff too. So,
absolutely.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up here. Till next time, folks. Max out.
Adios.
All right. I'm going to leave the stream up for a second so I can type in the links. I typed that one in wrong.
They look like they're like professional. They got personal home stuff.
Ubiquity, is that where?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they kind of aim at like small businesses and like prosumer stuff. I mean, people kind of describe it as the Apple of networking gear, which I think is pretty accurate. Yeah. So yeah, good Wi-Fi gear, good switches, routers, etc.
Like cameras and stuff. Yeah, I'd like to get some home
Oh
cameras.
yeah, cameras. Yeah. I've just been using their networking gear. They have like doorbells, cameras. They do more businessy stuff where they have like key card access stuff. It's a whole suite of things. I've kind of like
Are we talking
gone down the
about
deep end.
Unify? I missed
Unify,
I missed
yeah.
this.
Ubiquity, yeah. UI.com.
Yeah, I've got their stuff. I've got their doorbell.
Oh, really?